Hey everybody, welcome to What's Up Wednesday. I want to talk a little bit about automobile insurance this week. I think I've mentioned this topic or I've discussed this topic in the past, but if I have, it's been a long time. So ultimately, I want to touch a little bit on the importance of auto insurance for people because I don't know if people are properly educated on the best way to protect themselves. Now, the reason this comes up is when we have an incident in the field, it can go a lot of different ways, meaning a person gets in a vehicle accident, single vehicle accident, just them and their vehicle, or a multi-vehicle accident with a third party. And ultimately, when you purchase an insurance policy, which you should have, you can choose the limits for your policy and you're going to pay premium based on those limits. And a lot of times we see that people have kind of like the Allstate commercials mayhem. He talks about cut rate insurance. And what that means is very low limits of coverage. And generally speaking, I'm going to overly generalize this, but there are three different components to an auto insurance policy. One is a limit that covers damage to property or another person's vehicle. If you cause an accident with another vehicle or run a vehicle into a building, I would say a good minimum policy limit's $100,000 to cover the repair of damages. The second piece of that policy is going to be personal injury, bodily injury. And generally speaking, you want a minimum of $300,000 of bodily injury coverage if you hurt that driver. And then the last piece of that policy is the minimum's kind of a $50,000 piece, and that is to cover damage to the vehicle you're driving, whether you own it, whether it's rented, or whether somebody loans it to you. Now, again, these to me, these are kind of minimum policy limits, but unfortunately, we see that most folks don't even carry those bare minimums. So I'm going to put this into a business perspective now so that people can maybe understand why it matters a little bit. So for all of you out there who might be travelers, and let's just say that that us or another employer flies you to a project and we rent you a vehicle. If it's the right employer or they do things the right way, like we do, that vehicle is insured through the rental company. However, insurance on that vehicle applies to business use of that vehicle. And we know that when you fly somebody to a location and rent them a vehicle to use during the project, that their trips to the grocery store, their errands, some of those things, it's inevitable that they're going to have to drive that vehicle. Now that mileage, that driving is considered personal use of a rented vehicle. Therefore, if an incident occurs while you're using that vehicle for personal use, oftentimes the insurance provided by the rental company does not apply. So if you, worst case scenario, you go out with some buddies on Saturday night after work and you drink and you get in an accident and you hurt somebody and you get a DUI, again, worst case scenario, I know it can get worse than that even, but this is a horrible case scenario, then that insurance doesn't protect you. At that point, your personal insurance kicks in because that was under your own personal use. And maybe you hurt that third party, you definitely damage their vehicle, you damage the rental, which has been provided by the employer. But again, the insurance provided for the vehicle you're driving does not cover that personal use. So that's where that minimum $50,000, and I would actually recommend at least 100, would cover the damages to that vehicle, which would end up being the responsibility of the driver. So when we look at auto insurance, it's a very complicated thing. And a lot of times people need justification on why they should spend $1,000 or $2,000 a year on their auto insurance policy. Why, when I can get cheap insurance for $300 a year? That's the reason. Because if you get into a situation where, especially when you cause an accident with a third party, you're properly covered when they come after you. And I've seen that happen. I've seen where somebody was on an errand, they caused an accident. Initially, the third party driver was not injured, but later, when they got an attorney, they were, and they demanded the full amount of the policy limit for personal injury, which was $300,000. And And unfortunately, in that case, the driver who was using the vehicle for personal use, their policy had to be subrogated, is what you call it, in order to be able to meet that minimum criteria. So you want to make sure you're protected. The last thing that you want is somebody coming after you personally and filing a lawsuit against you because of damages due to the fact that you don't have adequate insurance. So drop us a note. If this is something you want to have a discussion about, I'm happy to have that discussion with you. I'm not an insurance expert, but I understand kind of how this whole thing works and I understand liability. And my goal is to educate people and do everything I can to protect you so that if you get into one of those situations, that you're properly protected. And keep in mind too, this would apply if you're driving a vehicle and somebody hits you, they're at fault in the accident. Oftentimes, again, you want to make sure you're properly protected and having the right coverages in place will ensure that. So hopefully you find that helpful. We'll see you next Wednesday.